The cops laughed as they tied a scruffy-looking man in a MAGA hat to a pole outside the precinct, mocking him for his views and calling him just another loudmouth. But 7 minutes later, their world turned upside down because that loudmouth was their incoming police commissioner. A man wearing a MAGA hat entered the local police precinct, his presence quiet but assertive. His appearance wasn't polished. The red hat was sun-faded, his jeans looked like they'd been worn through more than one storm, and his boots were scuffed dusty and well-traveled. He didn't carry the aura of wealth or power, only conviction. He didn't yell. He didn't cause a disturbance. But his very presence, his straightforward questions, and his subtle critiques of the precinct's disorganized environment made several officers bristle. Uniformed men and women behind desks exchanged looks, smirks quickly spreading across their faces. In their eyes, he didn't look like someone important. No clipboard, no press badge, no shiny shoes, no suit, no official escort. He spoke with clarity, but not authority, at least not the kind they recognized. And to some of them, the MAGA hat was enough to cast him into a category before he even opened his mouth. They didn't see a potential colleague, let alone a superior. They saw what they assumed was just another loudmouth Republican, probably looking to stir up trouble or rant about freedom and tyranny. Snide comments began to fly across the room. One officer cracked a joke about conspiracy theorists. Another whispered about getting another January 6th guy in the lobby. Without provocation, two officers approached the man and demanded identification. When he asked why, their tone sharpened. They questioned why he was asking questions. They challenged his right to critique the workspace. They didn't ask what brought him there. They decided he didn't belong. It didn't take long before things escalated. The man stayed calm, but his silence was mistaken for defiance. One officer claimed he was acting suspicious, though there was no reason given. Another remarked that people like him always think they know better than the law. Someone mentioned he could be one of those militia types justifying whatever followed. Instead of being escorted out or warned, the man was suddenly restrained. Not arrested, not read his rights, just restrained, cuffed with zip ties, his hat knocked slightly sideways, and walked out of the precinct lobby like a criminal without cause. Several officers followed, not out of protocol but out of curiosity, and some for entertainment. A few brought their phones. Outside the station, the man was secured to a metal pole by the parking lot entrance. It wasn't a formal holding spot. It wasn't policy. It was humiliation, pure and simple. Done with smirks. Executed with casual cruelty. Comments flew. One officer laughed that this would make a great meme. Another joked, "You want to defend law and order? Here's your taste of it." The man didn't flinch. He didn't shout or beg. He stood, hands behind the pole, eyes focused straight ahead. Some passing pedestrians slowed to glance at the strange sight. An older man in a red hat, bound in public by those sworn to protect. A few took out their phones. One teenager across the street started live streaming. The officers didn't care. They saw a powerless figure in a red hat, someone they assumed no one would believe, someone no one would defend. The mockery grew louder. Political jabs turned into personal insults. They mocked the hat, his clothes, his boots. Someone referred to him as Trump's janitor. Another called him Cannon's errand boy. One even suggested using the precinct's garden hose to cool him off. The man stayed silent. Their assumptions clouded every decision. The MAGA hat had become his identity in their eyes, and they judged every inch of him by what they believed that hat represented. Not one of them paused to wonder why he asked about station readiness. Not one of them questioned how he knew specific details about departmental operations. They saw what they wanted to see, a caricature of someone they were taught to dismiss. Inside the station, phones kept buzzing. Laughter echoed through the halls. Someone edited a photo of the man at the pole, adding sarcastic text over it, and shared it in a group chat titled Blue Banter. No one questioned the legality of their actions. No one seemed to worry about chain of command, about PR fallout, or even basic human decency. It had become a moment of collective mockery, a team-building exercise rooted in ignorance. They thought they were dealing with a nobody. They thought this man was beneath them. They didn't know his name. They didn't know his history. They didn't know what office he had just been appointed to. And worst of all, they didn't ask. For them, the MAGA hat was a permission slip to strip someone of dignity. It overrode protocol. It gave them license to laugh instead of listen, to punish instead of protect. And as the man stood tied to that pole, with more and more onlookers gathering and the video stream gaining viewers by the second, something shifted, not in the precinct yet, but out in the digital world. People watching began asking questions the officers had failed to. Who was he? Why was he there? And most importantly, why were trained professionals treating someone this way simply based on how he looked and what he wore? The answers would come, and when they did, they would hit harder than any policy memo or press scandal. Because the truth wasn't just about what the officers did, it was about who they did it to. The image of a man in a faded MAGA hat tied to a metal pole outside a police precinct was not something people expected to see in a modern, supposedly just society. And yet, there it was, broadcasted in real time by a high school student with a decent phone and an instinct for moments that felt wrong. The live stream didn't come with commentary. It didn't need any. The visual alone was jarring enough to ignite immediate outrage, confusion, and debate. Within 5 minutes, the video had passed 1,000 views. By the 10-minute mark, that number multiplied by 10. A growing wave of users, most of whom had never followed the page before, stumbled upon the broadcast by way of algorithm-driven suggestion. What they saw wasn't a criminal in distress or a protester being subdued. What they saw was a man who posed no threat, bound like a criminal in the open, surrounded by officers whose smirks and body language screamed mockery rather than professionalism. The internet didn't wait for an explanation. Comments flooded the live stream with rapid speed. Some users tried to identify the man, others zoomed in on officer badge numbers. Questions started appearing faster than they could be answered. Why is he tied up? What crime did he commit? Is this legal? Is this how officers are trained to treat civilians? The tone quickly shifted from curiosity to outrage, especially when viewers realized there had been no resistance, no aggression, no evident cause for such treatment. The stillness of the man and the casual behavior of the officers created a stark contrast. His calm demeanor, silent gaze, and unmoving stance suggested control and quiet power. This wasn't someone who feared humiliation. This was someone who had allowed the situation to unfold, a detail many sharp-eyed viewers began to pick up on. The idea that he might not be a victim, but someone deliberately observing, investigating, or waiting started to gain traction in comment threads. Speculation grew. Was he part of an undercover story? A journalist? A political figure? Screenshots began circulating on political forums, local news pages, and even Twitter accounts with blue checks. Activist groups picked up the story, demanding answers. Civil rights advocates began drafting public statements, asking if law enforcement had once again crossed a line. What might have been dismissed as a prank or unprofessional conduct was now under the microscope of public scrutiny, fed by digital momentum and amplified by public emotion. More concerning for the officers involved, the video caught the attention of individuals far outside the realm of casual viewers. A senior official in City Hall paused mid-meeting to rewatch the clip for the third time. His jaw tightened. Others in government, those who knew what had recently been approved behind closed doors, felt cold realization creeping in. The man in the red hat wasn't some random passerby. He wasn't a protester or a loudmouth provocateur. He was a newly appointed leader, one whose name hadn't yet been announced publicly for strategic reasons. And now, the city was watching its own officers tie that man to a pole like a criminal. Media outlets jumped on the story as confirmation started trickling in. Headlines were crafted within minutes. Police humiliate man in MAGA hat. Turns out he's their incoming boss. New commissioner publicly shamed before first day on the job. The twist added fuel to an already burning fire, and the video crossed over from social media into national discourse. Political commentators from all sides weighed in, each using the moment to push agendas or condemn actions. People who would have dismissed the man based on his hat were now forced to confront a more complex truth. The MAGA hat had provoked bias, but not just among officers. Even some viewers admitted they had made snap judgments, assuming the man was another fringe protester. Now, they had to reckon with the fact that the man they dismissed was about to hold one of the highest law enforcement positions in the region. This realization sparked larger conversations about assumptions, profiling, and the dangers of politicizing appearances. For the precinct in question, the moment of mockery was now a moment of crisis. Internal communication threads lit up with panic. Officers began scrubbing their social media profiles, deleting shared memes, trying to downplay or erase their involvement. But the internet doesn't forget. Every image, every video angle, every joke made in uniform was now immortalized and publicly dissected. The damage was already done. Legal advisors started making calls. Public relations teams were pulled from sleep to begin damage control. Union reps issued vague statements. City officials debated immediate suspensions. And somewhere behind closed doors, a new police commissioner sat in silence, watching the same footage the rest of the world had seen, but with a clarity no one else possessed. He had witnessed everything: how quick they were to judge, how ready they were to degrade someone who didn't fit their expectations. The viral moment wasn't just a flash in the pan. It was a cultural mirror. It showed in real time how uniformed authority could become emboldened by assumption and how the public could swing from judgment to justice once context was revealed. The man in the MAGA hat had already become a symbol, not just of political identity, but of how quickly dignity can be stripped when judgment replaces reason. And the reckoning had only just begun. The moment the video went viral, a chain reaction ignited behind government walls. From City Hall to the governor's office, high-level officials began issuing calls with urgency. The calm veneer of bureaucracy cracked under the weight of public outrage, internal embarrassment, and imminent liability. No one wanted their name attached to the fallout. And yet, their fingerprints were already all over it, on the appointment papers, on the silence that preceded the public announcement, on the failure to inform the precinct of their new leadership. The call that came through to the precinct wasn't routine. It didn't follow the polite chain of command or filter through middle managers. It came directly from city leadership, cutting straight through any formalities. There was no time for protocol, no patience for excuses. The instruction was clear and direct. Release the man immediately. No explanations, no questions. Just compliance. Inside the precinct, confusion turned into panic. Officers who had been laughing minutes earlier now stood frozen, realizing they had made a catastrophic mistake. Whispers of the caller's identity spread rapidly. Phones dropped. Faces turned pale. Some officers instinctively deleted messages, wiped group chats, and began distancing themselves from the situation they had just enjoyed mocking. But the damage wasn't confined to digital records. It lived in the expressions caught on camera, in the careless remarks overheard by bystanders, and in the silence that followed when the truth was revealed. The revelation that the man they had restrained was not a political agitator, but the newly appointed police commissioner hit, like a thunderclap. Not just because of his title, but because of what it meant. Every word spoken, every insult tossed casually his way, every moment of mockery now carried weight far beyond internal embarrassment. It was insubordination, public misconduct, and institutional humiliation, all wrapped in one. The truth forced a shift in perception. The very hat they had used to justify their judgment now served as a mirror to their own biases. They had dismissed him, not because of anything he did, but because of what they assumed he represented. They hadn't bothered to ask for his name. They hadn't followed proper protocol. They had made a spectacle out of someone whose authority surpassed them all, and now they would answer for it. The call from above wasn't just an order. It was a declaration. Lines had been crossed, and consequences were coming. City leadership scrambled to get ahead of the narrative. Press statements were drafted. Lawyers reviewed footage. Emergency meetings were held behind closed doors. The mayor demanded answers. Civil rights leaders called for disciplinary actions. The public, now fully aware of the commissioner's identity, demanded accountability. No apology could undo the symbolism of what had occurred. A man, presumed unimportant based on his appearance and political affiliation, had been publicly humiliated by the very people he was about to lead. And yet, through it all, he had remained silent, choosing not to assert his identity, not to demand recognition, but to observe. That choice now became its own form of judgment. His silence had revealed more than any confrontation ever could. It exposed how quickly power can be abused when prejudice replaces protocol. It showed how fragile the chain of respect becomes when it's based not on merit or behavior, but on shallow assumptions. And it laid bare the dangerous culture of mockery and groupthink that had festered within the precinct's walls. As word spread, institutions beyond the city took notice. National agencies monitored the situation. Leadership experts weighed in. Law enforcement think tanks began using the incident as a case study in failed leadership communication and internal culture rot. The commissioner had become more than a name. He was now a test case for what happens when rank-and-file arrogance collides with unrecognized authority. Behind closed doors, the officers involved were summoned one by one. Some were placed on administrative leave. Others were ordered to write statements. None of them could offer a defense that justified their actions. Ignorance was not an excuse. Bias was not a shield. The cameras had captured it all. Every smirk, every word, every unjustified step. The call from above echoed far, beyond its brief directive. It became the first crack in the facade of unchecked authority, a signal that leadership was no longer willing to tolerate insubordination masked as humor or prejudice disguised as policy enforcement. It was a moment of reckoning for a department too comfortable in its power, too careless with its assumptions. And at the center of it all stood a man who said nothing, but saw everything. The call did more than order his release. It shifted the entire balance of power. The same officers who laughed now stood in fear. The same voices that mocked now whispered in regret. The same precinct that ignored his presence now scrambled to recognize his authority. The man they tried to reduce to a meme had become their mirror. And they didn't like what they saw, because once the call came, there was no undoing the truth. They hadn't just tied a man to a pole. They had tied up their future, and now it was untying itself with full knowledge of who had done the knotting. The moment the press conference was announced, the world paused. It wasn't just curiosity. It was anticipation fueled by days of silence and speculation. No carefully worded press release, no spokesperson, no damage control operation could satisfy what the public demanded. The country had already formed its verdict, but the man at the center of the storm hadn't spoken until now. The image was unchanged. The same red MAGA hat, the same steady eyes. But now, behind the microphone, stood authority validated not just by title, but by unshakable composure. He didn't need theatrics or outrage. His presence alone silenced the noise. And when he finally spoke, it wasn't as a victim. It was as a leader with purpose and a message far bigger than politics. He didn't begin with blame. He didn't call names or condemn departments wholesale. He addressed the nation with a clarity that cut through division. This is not about a hat. It's not about what I believe. It's about how fast we judge when we think we know who someone is. It's about the lines that were crossed because of assumptions, because of unchecked culture, because of power without reflection. His words echoed beyond the walls of that briefing room. News outlets aired the entire address without edits. Social media clipped each sentence into viral sound bites. Not because the words were flashy, but because they were true. The kind of truth people don't expect to hear from someone in power. Then came the action. Immediate suspensions were announced, without the buffer of lengthy investigations or vague internal reviews. Officers were named, not protected. Footage was released before being requested. Transparency was no longer optional. It became policy. An independent task force was assembled on live television. Not a symbolic gesture, but a team with authority, funding, and a deadline. Their mission: audit every precinct, review complaint histories, interview civilians and officers alike. The commissioner didn't stop at the department that had detained him. He widened the scope. If it happened to me with all my privilege, imagine who it's happening to every day, who doesn't have a camera nearby. Mandatory retraining programs were rolled out, but these weren't the old slideshow lectures or checkbox certifications. These were immersive, confrontational, and run by people outside the law enforcement system. Psychologists, civil rights lawyers, victims of misconduct, all given the platform to reshape culture at its core. Some officers resisted. Protests emerged from within the ranks. Anonymous statements circulated claiming overreach and betrayal. But the backlash only amplified the commissioner's message. He didn't flinch. Accountability isn't betrayal, he said. It's leadership. And if that makes some uncomfortable, good. Change should never feel safe to the ones who benefit from the problem. Public trust began to shift. Not immediately and not everywhere, but visibly. Communities that once avoided precincts began showing up to the town halls he organized. People who had lost faith found themselves watching closely again, not because they trusted the badge, but because they trusted the man wearing the hat. His political identity, once the focal point of controversy, faded into irrelevance. It was no longer about red or blue. It was about right and wrong. Both sides of the aisle, long locked in endless blame, found themselves speechless as he challenged each to look inward. The culture of judgment doesn't belong to one party, he said. It belongs to anyone who stops seeing people as individuals and starts seeing them as enemies because of a label. Support poured in from unlikely places. Civil rights groups issued cautious but supportive statements. Former critics of law enforcement praised his transparency. Even seasoned political commentators, trained to find angles and divisions, struggled to frame the narrative in familiar terms. Because the moment had surpassed partisanship, it had become a mirror to the country itself. The officers who remained began to shift, too, not just because of fear or protocol, but because of example. The leadership above them no longer tolerated arrogance disguised as tradition. The standards were clear, and, more importantly, they were enforced. Whistleblower protections were strengthened. Complaint processes were streamlined and digitized for civilian ease. Each precinct was now monitored by a rotating team of external auditors. The message was unmistakable. Silence is complicity, and complicity ends here. But the reckoning didn't stop at policy. It reached into culture. Media depictions, school programs, and corporate training sessions began using the commissioner's story as a new model, not of shame, but of transformation. His message was simple, and it echoed in every platform that carried his words. We cannot rebuild trust until we're willing to tear down what made it necessary to rebuild in the first place. What had started as humiliation became revolution, and what the officers thought would be forgotten became unforgettable. Because the reckoning wasn't just public, it was personal, systemic, and historical. And this time, it wasn't going away. The dust had begun to settle, but the system was no longer the same. The ripple created by one incident had evolved into a current that swept through the ranks, reshaped leadership expectations, and forced even the most entrenched corners of law enforcement to confront their blind spots. The conversation had shifted, no longer centered on damage control, but on structural change. What had started as an embarrassment had become a moment of historic reform. Within the department, the culture was under reconstruction. The informal power dynamics, those unspoken codes that had enabled mockery, prejudice, and casual abuse, began to fracture. Officers who once felt untouchable now weighed every word. Respect was no longer given to the loudest voice in the room, but earned through conduct, integrity, and restraint. The hierarchy remained, but its foundation had changed. The commissioner's message continued to evolve. He didn't call for perfection. He demanded accountability. He didn't seek revenge. He instilled responsibility. His leadership was defined by calculated resolve, not emotional retaliation. That distinction redefined what authority looked like. And those paying attention realized they were witnessing a model they hadn't seen in years. The public watched closely as the reforms moved from headlines into policy manuals. Weekly updates were released on disciplinary actions, retraining completions, and citizen feedback sessions. Transparency was no longer a buzzword. It was a demand backed by metrics. Complaints dropped, not because issues disappeared, but because officers finally began acting with forethought instead of entitlement. Inside the precincts, a different kind of fear took root, not fear of cameras or exposure, but fear of disappointing a leader who had proven he saw everything, even when he said nothing. That fear transformed into discipline. Discipline matured into professionalism. And professionalism laid the groundwork for trust. The greatest shift wasn't procedural, it was philosophical. Officers began asking, not can I, but should I? A subtle but powerful pivot in decision-making. That ethical filter, once buried beneath cynicism, began to re-emerge. The badge once again started to represent service, not superiority. But even as the department changed, whispers remained. Rumors circled about why the commissioner hadn't identified himself that day, why he chose to endure humiliation instead of asserting authority. Speculations ranged from strategy to stoicism. But none of the theories captured the full truth. Only one man knew why, and he wasn't interested in explaining it to satisfy curiosity. What the public didn't realize, and what most of the department had yet to learn, was that the incident wasn't just an accident. It was an unannounced test, a deliberate decision, a calculated act of observation. The commissioner had chosen that moment not to assert power, but to reveal character, both his own and that of those he would soon lead. He had walked into the precinct not to be recognized, but to see how they treated someone they didn't have to respect. Not with cameras on, not with titles known. Just a man in a MAGA hat and a flannel jacket, unremarkable on purpose. And what he found was exactly what needed to be exposed. The fallout had proven his point. You can't train out bias that hides in laughter. You can't reform what you refuse to acknowledge. And you can't lead people you don't understand. So he chose to watch. He chose to listen. He chose silence, not as weakness, but as a weapon. And now, with the entire system aware of the truth, that silence roared louder than any order he could have shouted. Every officer, every precinct leader, every department head knew the unspoken lesson. The next time someone walks through those doors with no introduction, no uniform, and no obvious authority, they better be treated with the same respect they'd show the commissioner himself. Because from now on, anyone could be him. And everyone would be watched. Promotions were paused. Reviews became rigorous. New hires faced not just background checks, but psychological evaluations centered on empathy, composure, and humility. The recruitment posters changed from aggressive slogans to values-based messaging. The department's motto was revised, authority through honor. It wasn't just words. It was a reminder written into every wall. What began as public shame had turned into institutional rebirth, not through slogans or shallow apologies, but through principled leadership and unapologetic restructuring. The commissioner had rewritten the rulebook, not with vengeance, but with vision. And the department? It had two choices: evolve or be left behind. The final shift wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It settled in the quiet moments, an officer hesitating before raising his voice, a rookie taking an extra moment to de-escalate, a supervisor walking the floor instead of hiding behind an office door. The power had shifted, not away from the badge, but back to its original purpose. Because leadership didn't come from shouting orders, it came from making sure no one else ever had to be tied to a pole to prove they deserved respect. And now, the whole country knew it. If this story shocked you, like, share, and subscribe for more real power moments that expose the truth. Justice isn't just a word, it's what we do when no one's watching.